Hello, good morning and good afternoon. I am Barbie Siegel, CEO of Zeno Group. Thank you for joining us today, March 8th, to commemorate International Women's Day. We join women and men all around the world who are gathering to celebrate women's achievements. And as important, the inequities so many women still face across race, sexual orientation, life stage, and ability, all important topics we will cover today. As you know, this year's International Women's Day theme is Break the Bias, and the title of our discussion, Are You Ready to Break the Bias? We will hear today from 5 inspiring women. Their stories and life experiences will give us even greater resolve to do our part to break the bias. Before I turn the virtual floor over to our esteemed moderator, it is only fitting that we take a moment to hold in our hearts and minds our brave sisters in Ukraine and their neighboring countries. This International Women's Day is different. We cannot help but think about and pray for the millions of strong, courageous women in Ukraine and elsewhere who are leading from the front. The mothers caring for their babies in bomb shelters, the nurses tending to their sick patients underground, the journalists bringing us the stories we must see, and the volunteers at the border, ready with a warm meal and an outstretched hand. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Sam McAllister, author and former interview producer at BBC Two's News Night. Sam, over to you.
Barbie, an absolute pleasure to see you. It would be called Nice Night if you were there, absolutely. And it's a pleasure to be with you guys, every single one. Happy International Women's Day. I appreciate there are challenges and issues out there right now, but it's wonderful to all be here together, an absolute delight. And we've got a real treat for you today, some stellar panelists who I will come to in a moment. But as Barbie has just said, this year's International Women's Day 2022 campaign theme is Break the Bias. Obviously, hugely important issue for all of us. Whether deliberate or unconscious, bias makes it so difficult for women to move ahead. Now look, knowing that bias exists, which we all do, is not enough. Action is needed to level the playing field. And we have 4 dynamic panelists with us today. Thank you all so much for joining us, who will be discussing this crucial topic. Now, the first thing I'd like to do, if I may, is ask the panelists to introduce themselves, just a couple of lines, if you will, and explain why you are personally interested in this topic of breaking the bias. And Carmen, if I may, I'll come to you first.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. Carmen Daniels-Jones, President and CEO of the Solutions Marketing Group. My background is in disability marketing. I was injured in a car accident my junior year in college. I became a paraplegic and use a wheelchair for my mobility. I recognized later in my career a gap where companies targeted me as a woman and as a person of color, but not as a person who has a disability. And there are 61 million people in the United States, over 1 billion people internationally who are impacted by disability. So we really work to fill that gap. So I look forward to the discussion, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Carmen. If I could put the same question to you, Samantha. Thank you for joining us.
Hi there. Thanks for having me, and happy International Women's Day. I'm the CEO of She Media, and we are a network of women-led websites and social media creators, plus our owned and operated media properties. So we endeavor to produce meaningful lifestyle content for the 100 million plus audience we serve, and in doing so to put earning opportunity back to these independent websites and content creators who would otherwise potentially not have the opportunity to run their small businesses.
Thank you so much, Samantha. Michelle, you next, please.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me and happy Women's International Day. My name is Michelle K. Hanabusa, pronouns she, her, hers, and I am a Japanese Okinawan American, born and raised in Los Angeles. I am a founder and creative director for a community-based streetwear brand, and we use streetwear as a vehicle to amplify impactful and authentic stories of the underrepresented. We have fueled campaigns such as Hate is a Virus, Somebody's Beloved Fund, which gives back to several different beneficiaries around the country, Reimagine Everything, which benefits the Grace Lee Boggs Foundation, as well as movements such as Maganda Morenix, which talks about colorism within the Filipino community. I'm also a co-founder, for a nonprofit called Hate is a Virus, which is a community of mobilizers and amplifiers dismantling racism and hate.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I appreciate it. And finally, Kate, welcome, and over to you.
Hi, everyone. Happy International Women's Day. My name is Kate Kelly, and I am a human rights attorney and women's rights attorney, focusing specifically on constitutional equality. So I wrote a book called Ordinary Equality, and it's about the Equal Rights Amendment and all of the people across 100 years who have been fighting for constitutional equality.
I look very much forward to reading that, Kate. It sounds absolutely fascinating. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. And obviously, we've all got experiences in this field, unfortunately. And the first thing I'd really like to ask, and I'll come to you first, Kate, if I may, is one example in your life where you've basically helped to try and break the bias.
Ooh, one example. I think one of the things that's most important for me personally is seeing women in positions of power and authority, and seeing women speak out as leaders. And so that's something that I've tried to do in my life. And that I try to speak confidently, although sometimes it's difficult depending on the situation. So that's what I do personally. And then I think professionally and as a passion, what I'm really dedicated to is getting women into the Constitution. In the United States, it's one of very few countries, 85% of countries around the world have a gender provision in their Constitution, and the United States does not. So women are left out of the most foundational document in our country. And so I think breaking the bias really starts from the very, very beginning. We have to be in the Constitution. We have to be considered in our most foundational legal document.
Absolutely extraordinary. As a Brit, quite extraordinary to hear that, Kate. Michelle, what about you? An example that you have done to break the bias?
Yeah, absolutely echoing what Kate just said. I think this is even just a lifelong journey for me. It's as of recent where I've been really able to, use my voice and kind of be that first voice that interrupts any sort of bias that we might witness or we might experience. And so, as I get older, as I kind of gain more confidence in myself and just, the industry that I'm in, being able to stand up and, be that voice within the group. So, definitely witnessing and experiencing, the boys club within like the streetwear dynamic has been a challenge, but kind of being in that space for quite some time now and being able to be one of the few females in that space and being able to call things out has been really, really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also the courage that it takes to call things out. And we're more of that later, a really prevalent and problematic issue. And could I come to you, Samantha, on that question? An
Of course.
How to break the bias?
Yeah, so I'm probably more in the day-to-day zone of things I can control or try to control. And I think, so one of the things I've endeavored to do as a, long-term manager is to recognize to be transparent about my own life. And so if I am, taking an afternoon off to pick up my kids, I say so. I don't pretend I'm going to a meeting downtown, which I used to do when I was younger and didn't have as much control or power. I recognize that might make people think, gosh, moms don't work as hard, or moms are going to always put something else first. And I show that that's not the case by virtue of the leadership role I'm in. I show that you can be a leader and also be a mother, and prioritize both. The other thing just in this zone is giving space to other people. I'm a white, heteronormative, privileged woman. And so my degree of other is probably less than others in the room. And I speak of the patriarchy because in my industry, as in Michelle's, that is the presiding force of power. And so if I find voice, which maybe happened, 10 years ago, I try to recognize that others are still awaiting that space who might be in the room. So not just getting people in the room and being stoked about that, but actually saying, what do you think? And inviting others who might feel uncomfortable to speak to do so. So I'd say those are day-to-day things I can do.
And Carmen, if I may come to you on the same point.
Absolutely. I think for me, as a person who has a physical disability, it's nothing that I can hide. So, and there are millions of people who work and have non-apparent disabilities, but they have not disclosed that they have it because companies haven't created a culture of inclusion. So I think, one of the places where I start is just having an honest conversation with people to just get to know them. And in that process, you find out they have a child who's on the autism spectrum, or they're serving as a caregiver and they've never shared with anyone that they are and why they're stressed out at work. And so just having those conversations and then harnessing our power to provide a platform for people to be able to bring their full self to work. And I think with disability, it is in the diversity equation. It's the, redheaded stepchild. And it really should not be. It's just a dimension of who we are. And when given the opportunity, people are able to perform and exceed expectations. So it's just, again, having some of those conversations. I'm, like the previous panelists, what you see is what you get. I just bring everything I can to the workplace, and I'm very transparent about it. So that makes it relatable, and it also makes it dismiss any perceptions and biases people have.
I think that's a really great example, Carmen. I mean, Samantha was talking about how many of us over the years have sort of, lied or have a discomfort in revealing our true selves. And revealing the true self, of course, is fantastic and admirable. But some of these conversations, as we all know, have been fraught. They've been difficult. At times, they've been adversarial, unfortunately. And a lot of them have cast us asunder rather than bring us together. And I'm really interested in this point. And if I could come to you, Carmen, first, as we were just discussing it. How have you made sure that the people that you're working with have been heard, whatever their personal perspective on how bias works, whatever their personal experience?
I think the main thing is just one, to be open and recognize my own biases while we have these conversations. While I've described who I am, there are some areas where I'm not as astute, and I like to think I'm pretty woke, right? And so it requires that I dig a little deeper. I ask compelling questions to understand and not judge, and then provide opportunities where people who have even differing views from myself can be at the table and, ask, how can we do better in this XYZ space? What is it that we're missing? What barriers do we need to remove, and that type of thing. So I think it all really, really starts with a lot of introspection in terms of, and I will say, George Floyd's murder shook the globe and made people have those tough introspective conversations about where they stand, where they're biased, where they're privileged. And so the door is open for us to have that dialogue. And I think it is incumbent upon us as leaders to continue to go through that door.
I think it's really important what you've just said about those tough, important conversations. Now, I gather, Samantha, from what you said on your opening answer, that that's a conversation that you've been having with yourself and obviously with society as a whole. And what have you done to help your workforce have that conversation in a way that is meaningful?
Well, I certainly think I haven't solved this. And maybe the more I recognize that, I don't know that we'll ever be free of our biases. I think it's kind of like when you say, I'm not racist, and you are judging whatever, wherever you're coming from. I don't know that the human existence is such that you cannot judge other people in one way or another, hopefully positively, hopefully with, an awareness of what you're bringing to it. But it's a pretty existential conversation. So I do think it's important to bring it into a framework that works for everybody. I agree 100% that prior to, it's messed up, but prior to the very public discussions that emerged from George Floyd's public murder, I didn't start every sentence with my privilege. Like, I learned that it was something, and I was like, aghast that it hadn't occurred to me that I had that. So I think the more we can sort of be vulnerable and admit our own biases, as Carmen said, and not indicate that any of us are free of that just because we've made it to a leadership position, but rather be clear. I had one the other day that was interesting, and it became a conversation in our return to work. I have two guys who are about to have offspring with their partners who happen to be women. And in both cases, they were like, well, what if, reading the handbook saying, am I the primary caregiver or the secondary? And I was like, the secondary. And so that's 3 weeks, not 3 months. And that was so wrong-minded. I realized later, I was like, oh man, I just totally not just contributed to perhaps making you feel marginalized, but perhaps more important to me, I made the woman the primary caregiver from the minute the child arrived. So I just stuck her in a position. So I think I think open conversation where you're curious instead of judgmental, which is a learning for me. You're curious about where your biases come from and trying to unpack those allows the uncomfortable conversations to be a bit more empathetic, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? It comes from a place that we all have to face with humility, and we have to deal with discomfort, which is something that often we try to avoid and evade. And as leaders in particular, hard to admit when you're wrong. And obviously that's something that needs to change. I mean, Michelle, coming to you on that, what do you think is important to look at in these areas going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I loved what Samantha just said too. I think there is a lot of learning and then also a lot of unlearning, right? There's so many different things that we experience throughout our lifetime where we don't even realize that we're doing. And it takes someone to call you out, or maybe just being a little bit more introspective with what you're doing. We have a lot of younger teammates on both ends of the organizations that I run. And so I really appreciate when they call me out too, because it takes me, to step back a little bit and be like, where did this come from? Why did I even get myself into this position? And it's a really good balance to be able to have these conversations, especially with folks of the next generation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Kate, if I could come to you next. So, as we said, we've mentioned your book about ordinary equality, the fearless women and queer people who shaped the US Constitution and the Equal Rights Amendment. And that word ordinary, I think, is really important because we also come from the privilege of, leadership or seniority, right? And lots of these conversations raising issues around bias can be frightening. I'm sure we all have personal experiences. We've heard tales or directly experienced it. Resistance to speaking out, fear it may harm our career or impede us going forward, our promotions. Basically, we're going to be troublemakers. These are all languages and things that we understand, right? So, Kate, can I ask, what have you done to try and encourage people? I appreciate in your legal setting, you're trying to do something macro, but on a micro level to speak freely when they face problems like this. What's your advice?
Well, I think as whatever groups we're part of, we can help people understand that we can speak up by doing it ourselves and sticking ourselves out on a limb and encouraging them to come forward. So if another woman in a space says something, instead of just being like, oh man, I'm glad she said that, I didn't want to say that, we can echo her or say, I was thinking the same thing, or reinforce what she said. If there are men on this panel, it's a really great thing to shine light on women in a positive way. So if a woman has an idea first, make sure to credit her. But by the same token, if a woman brings up something in a workspace that she's been, suffering, believe her, echo her, support her, say, I saw that too. I was part of that. Or, there are lots of ways that men can really make a safer space in the workplace for women to speak up. And you don't always know what people you work with are experiencing. I'm queer, and people think queer people look a certain way. And so a lot of people are very surprised when I'm LGBTQ. So they might say something, not thinking everyone in the room is straight. And then I'm like, actually, I'm not. And my partner is a woman, and this is my experience. So I think it's also not making assumptions about who people are without knowing, more about their life. And they might not want to share it because you haven't created an environment that's welcome. But wherever you can, making a space, supporting people. When I see queer people and coming into my workplace, I say like, hey, I reach out to them specifically. I welcome them. I say, I'm in the same boat. These are the things I've dealt with. Hey, did you know this about our health insurance? Just making a space for people to know that there is support, to know that if they speak up, they won't be alone, that they will have backup, they will have support. And sometimes if you're in a position of leadership, to do it for them. If you see something happen, don't leave it to someone who is, just started or lower in their career or experiencing these things. If you say it and you speak up, you don't have as much to risk. And so I think that's another thing. In addition to amplifying concerns that people bring forward, bring them forward yourself if you're in a position where you're insulated from some of the consequences.
I think that's great advice, Kate. I have to say, speaking as someone who's, worked their way up the ladder slowly but surely, that, the times when you would have a boss, male or female, or anybody on your side, in a sense, who would call that kind of behavior out and didn't have the risk. I think that's really, really great advice. I mean, Michelle, one of the things you just mentioned on that front was that as you're getting older, as you put it, you have more confidence. And this really speaks to that issue about having the confidence to challenge bias. Is that something you related to in what Kate was just saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there is a power to echoing. There's a way that you could even, inspire others to find that courage to then speak up. And it might not be right then and there, right? It might take some time, but being able to witness someone stand up or speak out can hopefully encourage you to also do the same in the future. And so, I've had those instances when I was younger where no one spoke up in the room, and it kind of just, it builds up. And then that one moment where I did witness someone, stand up for you, that was, I think, the shift for me to be like, wow, I'm going to do that too, moving forward.
Yeah, and you never forget that person, right? Whoever that person was, we've all had those moments. I mean, Carmen, you raised something I think that's really important here about the difference between visible bias and invisible bias in the terms and things of what we bring into a room that we can and can't control. I mean, Kate was talking about assumptions made around her and her sexuality. I mean, on that front, what types of bias have you encountered and how have you navigated it personally?
I think the biggest bias is that people are, one, curious, sometimes to a fault. They want to know what happened. They ask inappropriate questions. What happened to you? How do you drive? How do you, you're a single mother. How do you do this? So that, it's managing other people's perceptions as they project them onto me. I had a woman kind of chase me down in a Target parking lot, and she was amazed that I drove my vehicle. And I told her, I said, I drive, I swim, I travel, I pay bills. I had to kind of dismiss all of her perceptions all in the parking lot in 40 seconds. So, I think it's being open. They're not every day is a day that I feel like educating people, but I recognize there's someone coming behind me. If I have the right type of conversation with the right attitude, their mind and perception will be more open when someone comes behind me and, a student from Syracuse University who has a disability and they're applying for a job, and they'll think, oh, if Carmen can do it, then maybe they can do it as well. So it's recognizing, and I say this with humility, that I carry a mantle of responsibility to conduct myself in a way where I'm accessible, where I'm open, where other people who do not have the same platform or the same seat at the table that I have, I try to conduct myself in a way that it makes it easier for someone else behind me, because it takes, in terms of work, it takes a person with a disability 10 times as many interviews to try to land in a position. And I've been very blessed and fortunate that throughout my career, that has never been an issue, but that's not the case with everyone. So I want to ensure I'm not the only one at the table trying to influence and make a contribution in the workplace.
I mean, I think that sounds extraordinary, Carmen. It's very sort of like open of you to talk about the responsibility of that. It also sounds exhausting. It's tiring, right? Like constantly checking yourself, thinking about the future generation. I mean, do you feel that, Carmen? Do you feel a kind of exhaustion with it, or you just have, the ability to carry on regardless because of the things you've just articulated?
Well, I've been a wheelchair user for this year it'll be 36 years. So I became a paraplegic when I was 2. I'm kidding. No, I was actually 20. And so, it's just become a part of who I am, so much so that even my daughter, who does not have a disability, she tries to educate her friends, and she's decided to major in physical therapy as a result of our lived experience. And so, some days I have a game face on and I'm not going to stop and have the conversation if I'm just running into the store. But it can be exhausting. But I also am ready to educate, getting on a plane, that is exhausting, educating someone in terms of what you need to get on the plane. And I'm thinking of a lot of daily encounters, but again, making it easier for someone else and also empowering that person in that process so that they can begin to relax and let go of any perceptions and bias that they have.
Well, Samantha, may I come to you on this next question?
Sure.
Have you seen enough progress on equality in your life and work?
That's a biggie.
Sorry.
Enough. No, I mean, enough. Systemic racism and sexism are going to take a minute. I have seen a lot of progress. I think I'd speak to probably women in the workforce. Sometimes you can't tell if it's window dressing or if it's real. I still know that when you get down to a room of men, that stuff comes out that, is not, look who we elected to president recently. That's not too emblematic of progress to me, not to get political. But I think that, the comfort with sexism hasn't gone away, or sexual objectification of women. But it's become less acceptable to say it. And I think there's become more structural interest in diversity in the workforce. So I would say not enough. I have a daughter who is a Gen Z, and she has said things, probably trying to antagonize me, like, aren't we done with the whole woman thing? Because she's much more focused on equality within gender, sexuality, and race. That's her, that's her focus. And it's kind of like, shut up, white privileged woman, which is fair, totally fair. But also, I'm like, we're not done. My God, never mind sex trafficking. And also, just women are not equal, not a long way from equal. So I think that window dressing might give us a sense that everybody on this call has the same opportunity, but we don't within the set of women, and we don't within the set of humans. So no, there hasn't been enough progress.
Well, Michelle, what about you? What do you feel in terms of the time that you've been working in the role that you've been doing? Have you seen progress? Do you feel positive about some of the things, or are there things you're still feeling very negative about?
Yeah, I think this is a tough one, because I think in a broad scheme of things, I feel like, we have a long way to go. And, pre-pandemic, I used to do a lot of business in Asia as well, in Japan. Japan is far from being even like where we are at right now. And so I think that's a whole nother conversation. I think in the space of racism, hate crimes that's been going on, even way before the pandemic, right, within the Asian American community. I feel like we have now been able to have honest conversations with older generations who have never even wanted to talk about these experiences that they may have experienced, or even have these types of conversations at the dinner table. That is a very, like, you know, a unique experience within the AAPI community, I think, because there's a lot of things that go unspoken. And so now that these issues have been raised and we feel a little bit more open to talking about these things, I feel that there has been somewhat progress, but within the Asian American diaspora, there's a lot of work to be done too. There's a lot of biases that we need to break within our communities. So long story short, I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. That theme of work obviously is something that we all relate to in different ways, whether it's with children or older generations or younger generations or people we work with. I mean, I'm really interested in this point. If I come to you, Kate, obviously with your legal mantle on, I used to be a criminal defense barrister myself, so I have some relatable content on that front. What's really holding us back from making more accelerated progress? What are the barriers that you see on that front?
I think this in part ties to the question that you asked before, which is how much progress have we made? I think rumors of our progress have been greatly exaggerated. Many people, especially younger people, think that men and women are equal until they enter the workforce. It's difficult to understand that we're not. I hear a lot of women say, well, I feel equal. I feel respected in my home or in my workplace. But what I usually say is equality is not a feeling. Equality is measurable, and in every measurable way conceivable in our country, women and men are not equal. Whether that's pay and compensation, whether that's equal access to opportunity, whether that's a position in governance, whether that's success in litigation. I mean, every conceivable and measurable category, we have not achieved equality. So I just repeat again and again, equality is not a feeling. It doesn't matter how you feel. And I'm glad that you feel respected, and I'm glad that you feel promoted in your workplace, but that doesn't mean that we have achieved equality. And so it's actually kind of difficult to convince people they don't have something they think they do. It's the opposite problem that we had in previous generations. In the 1970s, when we had a huge women's movement, women couldn't get a credit card. Women couldn't own things in their own name. It was the bias was so obvious. And now, because we've made a lot of superficial progress, the bias is less obvious. There are women, maybe not on the board of the company, but maybe there's a woman executive, or maybe there is a single woman figurehead or a spokesperson, or maybe there are people of color at different levels in a visible capacity, but not in leadership. And so I think the patriarchy, for lack of a better word, has gotten much better at hiding and hiding the ways in which we are discriminated against. And that makes it difficult to make progress, because you can make a lot of superficial changes that make things look better and aren't actually better for the people who experience them. So I think it's important to remember that there are ways to measure whether or not we are equal, and we have not achieved that. I mean, in my book, I look a lot at suffragists and women from the 1920s and 40s, and the things they were talking about are still things that we're talking about today. One of the people I wrote a chapter about is Crystal Eastman. She's one of the co-authors of the Equal Rights Amendment, and immediately after they passed the 19th Amendment, giving women the vote, she gave a speech, and she said, "Now, at last, we can begin." Getting the vote was the very beginning of what they envisioned as what equality would be. The other things she named were equal opportunities in the workplace, what she called voluntary motherhood, birth control, all of these things that we're still fighting for today 100 years ago women were talking about. So when you measure it by that, it's actually pretty depressing how little progress we have made. If a woman in 1920 was talking about things that we still have not achieved and in fact are losing today, it's important to keep that longer perspective. Not only do we have a long way to go, we're also losing a lot of the progress that we have made.
I think it's
Sorry
really,
to be depressing.
no, it's not depressing. It's honest. And I think also, I think we've probably all been through that experience where we're told to be grateful in a sense for the inequality that we face, that somehow we're meant to be, being thankful that we're allowed to, have a vote or stand for office, those kinds of things. And I think that's a real shame. I was struck somewhat being over the pond where we've had a couple of female prime ministers, that you guys recently had a woman in charge while a man had a colonoscopy. I mean, that really depressed me, I have to say. May that change soon. May that change soon. I mean, obviously a huge thing that we've been looking at with the pandemic has been the burden on women and particularly on caregivers during that entire period. Homeschooling, which we had here, what a living hell if you have children, all those kinds of things going on, caring for parents, that kind of situation. I mean, Carmen, can I come to you on that one? Do you think that the pandemic has opened the door for more conversation and action because we've been more open with our emotions, our family lives, our backgrounds, or do you think it's deepened bias?
I think it's helped tremendously within for the disability community. So many people who have children who have disabilities were able, with some support, to work from home, and that removed the need for having, to go to a myriad of appointments with their children. They had some continuity and they kept their kids safe. Additionally, for years, and I do mean years, ever since I became disabled in the 80s, there was always an argument from corporate America that said, people can't work from home. They can't work from home. They won't be as productive. People with disabilities can't work at home. That was a barrier. Within a week, this week is the week 2 years ago that the world shut down. And within a week to 10 days, the whole world was working virtually. And then it opened the dialogue that people who have a range of disabilities and needs can be productive working at home. We've all been productive, and we've probably all worked more, because once you've done your 8 hours, 9, 10 hours, then you make dinner, exercise, whatever, take care of your children, and come back to your computer around 9, 10 o'clock and do more work. So I think the pandemic has been, while awful, let me start there, awful. I mean, I had COVID at one point in this journey. It has also changed how we work. It's made us more appreciative. And I think people have been able to bring more of themselves and their humanness to their workplace. It's not uncommon to be on a Zoom call and you see a dog walking by, or you hear a kid throwing a toy, and people are
loud cat behind me, just in case you hear that. I apologize.
Not a problem. And people are more patient and understanding regarding that, where before, I don't think we allowed that level of authenticity to come through in the workplace.
Yeah, I love that authenticity. I have to say, with all the events I've been doing, I was already quite authentic. It's emboldened my authenticity even further. And whether that's for good or for bad. I mean, Samantha, you were talking earlier about that need to sort of, delineate, oh, actually, I'm going to have my tooth done. It's not like I'm a mother picking up my children. I mean, working from home obviously has changed those parameters, hasn't it? Have you found that that's a positive thing? We don't have to make up excuses anymore. We can just turn off the Zoom and the child arrives home, or we go and pick them up. We can run our own day. Has that been something great?
Well, so personally, I've benefited. Carmen, that's so interesting. It had not occurred to me. I should call out the difference in an experience for a person with disabilities. I was about to say the pandemic's been terrible for women because of $800 billion of lost income that's globally. And it had not occurred to me at all that it would be a game changer. And it's so logical. So that's embarrassing and a huge bias. So thank you for showing us that. And for people with autoimmune, or, who I work with, or any who have, I didn't realize, been scared to go on the subway for most of their, careers. in New York. So that's wild. I'm like still reeling from my lack of awareness at that point. But there are pretty intense reminders that women are going to be the domestic housefrows. Also, my husband already worked from home, and which is one that I have to often explain, not nearly as onerous as other people's needs to educate, but like, it's not weird. He's not less of a man because because he happens to be the primary caregiver. But so it's been wonderful, frankly, personally, despite the horror of some of the outcomes, many of the outcomes. But it's made a really intense awareness for me of that I used to defend my desire to be in the office all the time. Like I'd be so miserable if I had to be at home, because I think that was a defense for me in my earlier motherhood. Now I'm like, this is valuable time I was missing, and I really do value it. And I think that it plays to a lot of women's strengths, not to generalize about our gender, but the communal, like the having the dog in the background, I have a bird in the background, but also the offspring, and that seems to be something I feel more comfortable with than some of the guys I work with who are like, shit, I have to admit that I have children, like things that are not work. So well, I think it plays to a lot of our strengths. It's set a lot of interesting community. And now, Carmen's brought up an excellent educational point to me. Anna Loudis, ageism, which is also rampant, seems to have been mediated a bit in the workplace. But there's also $800 billion of loss, and women are the primary caregivers for their elders and their youngers. And so the data, to Kate's point, is not good.
I mean, Michelle, if I may come to you, I mean, obviously, that's great to hear those positive examples. I appreciate that many people in the Asian community in particular faced, enormous discrimination during the period of the pandemic, and some of the attacks on people through ignorance and misunderstanding about, the flu and those kinds of problems. Was that something you faced personally, or did you have a positive experience? Was it a mixed bag? What was your experience? You're on mute, Michelle.
Sorry, I'm on mute. I do want to point out that this has just come to the light, right? Our experiences that we've experienced this ever since we first immigrated to America. So nothing has changed. It's just now, in media, people are talking about it more. People are here to listen to our experiences a little bit more. I think that this pandemic has been really, really tough on our community. It continues to be really tough, even with the most recent incidents that just happened. I went to go see even the opening day of Batman. The first 10 minutes, it was probably the most triggering thing that I've witnessed, and on screen, and I had to walk out for a little bit. So I think. And it's interesting because I think it's like trending on Twitter today, talking about the movie. But sorry, I don't even remember your question.
It was whether or not it had been largely a positive or a negative experience for you during the pandemic. We've heard some positive stories there. Whatever you personally feel.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's just been really tough on our community. There's value in collective healing. And I think those are things that we are trying to figure out within our broader community at this point.
Thank you for your honesty, Michelle. I appreciate it. I'm sorry about the Batman experience as well. I'm not due to see that yet, but I'll be looking that up, that information. Kate, could I come to you? Obviously, we like to be, as women and as powerful women, however we identify ourselves, or, semi-powerful women, however you want to see yourself, as people who can be proactive, that we can do something. So could you give me 3 actions companies can take now to help eliminate bias in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, when you look around and your workplace looks a certain way and potentially all like you, the reason, in this example, we'll use women. If women don't work at your workplace, that's on you, not on them. If women aren't applying in great numbers, women are over 50% of the population. So 50% of your applications aren't women and people of all marginalized genders. That's because you have not created a workspace that welcomes them and that encourages them to apply. There might be lots of reasons for that. They may Google you, look at your website, and realize that there's no one like them at your organization. And so there's going to have to be a lot of active work on the part of CEOs, on the part of people in positions of power to attract talent and to make a workplace that is one that women feel comfortable in and that women feel like participating in. So concrete, a lot of people talk about childcare options. I don't have any kids, I'm childless by choice. But when there are childcare options at my workplace, even though I don't have any children, I know that it is easier for the people that I work with. It's easier for me to meet with them. It's easier for me. It's easier for them to have that time to dedicate specifically to the projects we're working on together. So even as a person with no children, I think providing adequate childcare and access to childcare and flexible work schedules is just like absolute rock bottom. Like you have to do that in order to have an inclusive workspace. The end, there's no other option. And in most other developed countries and other nations, that's bare minimum. I think childcare is the first, and healthcare is another one. Providing adequate healthcare for your employees, and that specifically, I will highlight trans inclusive and LGBTQ affirming healthcare. That isn't just every policy. That's a very important and specific policy that folks have to look into in order to providing healthcare for people of all gender minorities. And again, I think this is like bare minimum, like basic, like must be done in order to improve access to the workspace. And then I will say the third thing is active recruiting. It's not just putting out a posting and being like, no women applied, so I don't know what to do, or no people of color applied, so I don't know what to do. We just hired the most qualified person who applied. Well, you're not doing your due diligence. It has to be very active. You have to seek out. There are talented people. There are talented women. And if they're not, then you have like a very big problem in your industry that you should be a part of solving. If there are no talented people of color, and if there are no talented women in your industry has a huge amount of work to do starting from primary school all the way up to educating and creating a pipeline of people who can participate in your industry who have been traditionally marginalized and excluded. So I think the last thing I will say is just really active recruiting of talented people and women of color. And if they are refusing job offers at your organization, then you have more to work on to make sure that they feel included and welcome and enthusiastic about coming to your workplace. So those are the three things, but I could say more.
Thank you, Kate. That's hugely helpful and proactive. We like to have something we can specifically do. I mean, Carmen, on that front, is there one thing in your company or in your workplace that you would like to do now further to assist with breaking the bias?
That's a big question, and I thank you, Kate, for all those insights. I think the biggest thing would be probably piggybacking off of what Kate said, expanding recruitment sources. I mean, you go to a job fair, you have an event and you check that box, but if any group confronted or experienced the type of discrimination that the disability community does, it just wouldn't exist. That people would be singing from the rooftops that this cannot happen, and there would be so much advocacy. So I believe the biggest thing is just expanding your recruitment sources, because just quick story, my father started in IBM in 1965, a year after the Civil Rights Act passed, right? And so IBM was very intentional to change the fabric and the diversity within the company. And as they did so, they were able to attract more people of color at that time. And so I think it's just that fundamental that companies have to be willing, one, to address where they're missing it. Two, they have to identify what the barriers are in terms of recruiting. And three, when you have more people inside the company, you begin to become a welcoming place. People, it's very unspoken, but people begin to say, you know what? If whomever is there, regardless of their dimensions of diversity, there may be a place for me. And if I see them advance, then there may be a place for me to advance. That was the power, politics aside, of having Barack Obama as the president, because there were millions and millions of children of color who said, I can do something that has never been done before. And so again, it's changing what's happening inside to ensure that it reflects the beautiful dimensions of diversity that exists within our country.
It's so interesting you say that, Carmen. I know you did work with the Obama administration in the Department of Agriculture with minority farmers, and obviously must have really changed your life and the way you looked at your country. I mean, from my perspective as a Brit, for better or worse, whatever one thought of her politics, I grew up in a time where I had a female prime minister, and I know that changed completely my perspective on what was achievable. I thought I could be anything. And I hope that, that gift that we can give to one another by being in positions of leadership is potent and intoxicating. It never occurred to me that a woman couldn't lead my country or indeed yours. I mean, Samantha, could I come to you on that one? I mean, what can employees do to advance greater equity? Let's imagine right now, one of your employees or somebody in this audience is facing bias. What advice would you give them in trying to do something about it?
If you're somebody who's facing bias, I hate to say it, but it depends a lot on the industry, the level you're at also. And when you're in a leadership position, you have more power. I think it's easier sometimes to make change. And that's where the numbers are so important. And I think I was going to say that giving yourself quant goals as a company is important, and then reporting back on those goals so that you go beyond intent and into holding yourselves accountable. So true reporting on your own numbers and whether they're good or bad or you're proud of them or not. But to someone who is experiencing bias, I think finding your group, which is not easy if we haven't created a group internally, but finding others with whom you relate differently than you might your own department, so that you can, and I think it's okay to reach out to someone you don't know. And I think affinity groups have given more of that opportunity, and recommending, and I don't know if it's really trite, but recommending affinity groups to your manager, saying, hey, this is also, if your manager is not from a diverse background, she or he may not understand that a certain affinity group, it should be an affinity group, but recommending those, offering to lead it is hard to resist for a manager. If someone says, I'd like to lead the queer Latina group, I'm like, great, that's awesome. You're taking initiative. So I think coming up with something proactive for your manager might be a good idea. I know it's extra work and that's not fair. But I think that's one way to manage. I wouldn't shy away from reporting things, from documenting things, and don't, I guess, try really hard not to be worried that there will be some kind of retaliation. Although there might be.
Hard though, right?
There might be. Like it's real. It's real. So I think I do think finding your people, your peers, but also asking someone to mentor you, who's there, who knows the company. That's hard to resist also. So if you're facing bias and you're not in a leadership position, I think actually requesting a mentor, and then those of us who are in leadership positions can actually assign that, because the problem isn't just hiring, it's what happens once people get to a company. Are they advancing, or are they, same with college, are people who are minorities in the room having the opportunity to advance and through into power positions? And I think we sometimes are like, done, we hired diversely.
That's that.
And then filling the pipeline. So going back to high schools and, schools that are in Title I areas, so that you're, for us media, you're filling interest and access. So I'll stop there because there's lots, like Kate said, there's like, we could.
No, thank you,
Separate
Sandra.
Can I just add one more thing? Oh, I have so much to say about this. But I will also just add that I think often people think that women have to mentor women, but a lot of my mentors have been men. So I think it's very important because, especially since in many halls of power and in many companies, men are the only ones who are leaders right now. It's very important for men in companies to understand themselves as mentors to young women. They have to learn how to do that appropriately. That's not that difficult. You can do it. You know what I mean? Like, it's easy not to be a creep. This is not hard. And with appropriate boundaries and additional training, I think men at the highest levels of all organizations and institutions also need to be mentors to young women.
Michelle, it would be remiss of me not to mention something that I'm very interested in about your past, to do with competitive sport. I know that you were involved in competitive sport, figure skating, and it had been your hope to go to the Olympics. And so, unfortunately, an injury ended that. But you've worked in such very different arenas. I mean, what an extraordinary achievement to have been doing that in competitive sport. Has there been a moment where you've witnessed, either in that previous incarnation or your current one, an advance or change around gender bias that's encouraged you?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think in the figure skating world, there are many, 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 many stories that I have when it comes to bias, when it comes to even, racism, kind of bucketing Asians to just, we are all the same Asians. So you're going to skate to any Asian music, there's those types of things too. As I left that industry, I think I was really just trying to find myself again because I was a figure skater for 14 years. That is the only thing that I knew throughout my childhood and then my early adulthood. So going into an industry, and I actually, Samantha, what you were saying actually sparked kind of a story that I wanted to share was, I became a graphic designer. I was designing books, and there was one book that it was actually for a DEI group. We went through rounds and rounds of revisions, and at the very end, I was told to remove some of the pages because it showed that there was no female leadership in the entire company. And there are many, many steps to all of this, but one of my mentors, one of my bosses at that time, who was a female, she spoke up, and because of that was fired. And I think witnessing that, although it was a very, very, I was young, so it came as a shock for me that something like that could happen. It was someone like her who then helped me encourage myself to do something about it. And I wasn't at that place where I could speak out just yet, but witnessing that forced me to leave kind of the systems that I put myself in, right? Systems where it's like, I need a 9-to-5 job. I need to be that perfect Asian, excelled human that my parents wanted me to be. Like, I left that, and that was the start of my entrepreneur journey. She's still a really good friend of mine, and I really, really, yes, I think her courage gave me the courage to kind of keep going.
I thank you for sharing that. I think that's just, in the perfect sense, it sums up everything we've been speaking about so far so profoundly. It's the kind of Schrodinger's cat, right, of breaking bias. You can simultaneously be courageous and lose your job at the same time. It's a real shame. I mean, Kate, on that front, and unfortunately we have to sort of round up this part of the conversation shortly. We're going to be going, though, don't worry, onto audience submitted questions. So we're going to keep talking. But Kate, on that particular front, have you advocated for yourself? Obviously in your profession, that's what you're doing all the time as a human rights activist and lawyer, but for yourself to break a specific identity bias that you've been faced with. Did you make it through that? And what kind of tools did you find helpful?
Yes, I can think of many examples, but one concrete example, when I started the position I'm in currently, they said, oh, we'll just start you at the salary you were at your previous job. And this is, of course, very, very problematic for many reasons. Most women end up in lower pay because they were paid in their previous position lower than they should have. So basing pay on previous pay perpetuates that bias. So what I did is I found the salaries of all the 10 of the people in the organization who had my same position and were similarly situated. So went to similar law schools, had similar amount of experience, et cetera. And I said, this is what these people are making. I have this same amount of experience. And so I expect to make this amount of money. And they said, yes. So I think one of the things we can do to help each other is arm each other with as much information as possible. Sometimes it's not always possible to know everyone's salary in the organization, but you can do comps, you can do other things to help yourself understand what the market is. And always, again, if you've been discriminated in a past workplace and your salary is built on your past salary, you're going to end up far, far undervalued no matter where you end up, because even if you're climbing up, you started in a place where you were discriminated against in the beginning. So I think that's comparing yourself to similarly situated people and being able to make the case, not based on history, but based on your experience is something that you can do. And that's not just something employees can do for themselves. A lot of, sometimes employers are like, oh, I'll hire a woman, I have to pay her only half or far less than I would have to pay a similarly situated man. So employers can also do that. If someone comes in far lower than their peers, you can tell them, that's actually not the median for this salary is X, Y, and Z. So what you asked for is too low. And that happens you'd be surprised how often that happens with women. They're asking for more than they made at their last position, but that does not mean they're asking what they should be getting. So I think both the individual person can advocate for that, and the hiring manager and other people in position of leadership who can see behind the curtain and know what other people can make sure that they are not committing the absolutely heinous and grievous sin of paying women less for similar work.
I think that's a profoundly important conversation. And there's something going on over here in the UK at the moment to do with the lack of openness about how much you will be paid on a job advert. Such a simple thing, but as employers to actually specify a salary stops one of these little merry dances that we often do about trying to make sure that we're not asking for too much, too little. So, a practical thing that employers could do, just advertising the specific salary starting point to avoid that merry dance that you've just described. Now, absolutely fascinating conversation. I'm so grateful to all four of you. We're going to move now into a section where we've had some audience submitted questions that we're going to go to. So thank you very much to whomever it was that sent those in to us. We really appreciate it. And may I come to you first, Carmen? This question was, do you feel that biases against women and in your related areas of expertise are becoming more or less prevalent, and why?
I think it's more prevalent because we're talking about it, and before we did not as much. So regarding bias against women, there are some women who are blazing a trail, and I can say honestly, the bias faced by Black women and the biases faced by, women of color and white women are very distinct. And so I tend to see from my perch that more white women are very vocal around bias that impacts them. A lot of people of color, in my experience, are very vocal about issues that impact them as a person of color. And so, I think there has to be a bridge that's built where we can have a collective conversation where no one feels they're giving up power or giving up something by having that inclusive dialogue, because it is very distinct. I mean, you pick up any issue of Essence magazine and you will see an article within a 12-month span about, do white women and Black women get along? And so I think it's really important that as women, we have that conversation so we can find out the commonalities of what we have together and harness our power that way.
Yeah, absolutely. That point on commonalities, I'll come to you, Samantha, on that. This question from the audience member, do you feel that the biases against women are becoming more or less prevalent? And, is that commonality a way to start dealing with some of these biases?
I would echo the intersectional complexities. They remind me of early, sort of 70s feminism, where it was, they're just different types of sexism, because when you can, combine sexism with racism, sexism with anti-Semitism, with homophobia, you just get, it's multiplied. And they're the bridges for those of us who are who identify as women, I think can be really, really productive, while also recognizing that there are different degrees in the room of marginalization. And so I've seen I feel like maybe this is kind of myopic, but and I'm old. I've been in the workforce now for 30 years, so I've seen progress on the conversation there. I didn't get it as well before, so I might have not seen it. The issues of sort of degrees of marginalization. I think I'm being educated by people of color and people of sexual diversity in particular, and by the next generation in a lot of cases. So I feel like there's more, at least awareness. I don't see it among men, for what it's worth. I don't see men thinking about different degrees of women's marginalization and sometimes get a free pass on that. But I think the conversation is emerging. I think with any group of like women, the idea 15, 20 years ago was like, there's only room for one woman at the table. And like, who's it going to be? And that was really propagated by men in a lot of cases, because it's a really useful patriarchal device to put women against women. And it's likewise to put sexual differences against each other. So I do think that there's been progress in terms of women's actions for other women. But again, I'm coming from a pretty privileged one degree of other perspective. So I guess I will continue to learn in this area.
Well, I mean, on that front, Michelle, answering that question, do you feel that biases against women are becoming more or less prevalent in the area that you're working in?
Well, I think it is becoming more prevalent, especially in the areas that, well, it comes into two different spectrums, right? It's on one hand, the experiences that we have in the streetwear scene. There's aspects to that are different from the nonprofit with Hate is a Virus. And I think having more of these conversations, having more of these ways where we can open up those conversations and have more diversity, especially within the female aspect of things. We are currently going through this right now within Hate is a Virus of restructuring our organization as we're continuing to build the team and having more diversity. And what does that look like, right? It's not just having East Asians on board. It's diversifying on that way as well. Not only can we have female representation here, but what does that look like within that female diaspora? So these conversations are quite new in our industries, and I think that we have to just keep on continuing to further those conversations.
I think, Michelle, that leads really well into the second audience submitted question that we've had. And if I can bring Kate in on this, Kate, I mean, how can we make sure that this work, and it is hard work of diversity inclusion, doesn't only fall to what we would call, diverse staff? I mean, how do you recommend engagement for all employees? I think that's I noticed that in my workplace, that as soon as there's an issue of diversity, the person in the room goes automatically to the person that represents that diversity, which is obviously extremely problematic. What's your view on that situation, what we can do to make that better?
Well, what a long answer to this. I'm trying to cut it down. I will say that, I came out very recently, and I I previously was married to a man and was very heterosexual presenting. And now that I've come out and now that I am with a woman, um, it's there are panels and other things where experiences, working groups, yada yada, and I'm on them and I realize, oh, I'm the gay one. Like they invited me because I'm the gay one, and I haven't experienced that before in my life, and so there's a lot of things like, oh, well, we're doing this LGBTQ policy project, so like you should take it, right? And I'm like, just because I'm gay, like that's not my area of expertise. Women's equality and constitutional equality is my area of expertise. It's not like I'm not an expert just because I'm gay. And so I think there's a lot of like farming things off to people because of who they are that they might not necessarily be an expert in. And you know what? This is capitalism. Like we're talking about companies here, and the way that you compensate people for work in capitalism is through money. Like this isn't that hard. Like if you want people to do extra work, for example, lead a working group or a diversity initiative or whatever it is, the way that you compensate them is give them more money. I don't think it's that hard, it's not difficult. If you want someone to do different work that's not in their area of expertise, that they'll have to get caught up on, that they'll have to spend extra time on, compensate them for the work they're doing. And that does two things. One, it of course compensates them for their time, but it also expresses value. That's something that you as a company value. So if you're paying someone to do a diversity initiative, that means it's actually valuable to you. You think it improves the company. That's again, however you feel about capitalism, that is how we express value. So I think it's really important to compensate people adequately for these extra initiatives that they're being asked to do, and then also help them get training. Like I said, I'm not an expert in LGBTQ issues or policy. That's not my area of expertise. But if I agree to take on that project, help me get additional training, help me go to, whatever it's going to be required for me to become an expert in that. And again, that shows initiative, but it also shows that you're supporting that person in developing the expertise needed. So I would say support them both with money and the training they need in order to participate and make it successful.
Thank you, Kate. I love the practical points and ideas. I mean, Carmen, could I come to you on this one? I mean, you talked about collaboration just a little while ago. And, on this audience member's question, I mean, how do you recommend engagement across all employees?
Well, to piggyback off what Kate said in terms of compensation, I think it's incumbent upon CEOs in the C-suite to incorporate diversity, culture into performance objectives. I mean, if it can be measured and people are held accountable to it, they will act because it ties again to their compensation. Regarding employee engagement, after most companies do an employee engagement survey, and that identifies, because it's anonymous and people feel safe, that identifies where there are gaps. So I think it's really important to, once those survey results come in, to be very intentional and systematic and disciplined about how, one, the gaps will be addressed, two, very public in terms of how we share that information across the organization, and then three, outline the strategy and encourage and invite employees to become a part of the solution. And so, no one gets a pass. Everyone is held accountable in some capacity to participate. And it removes that, well, it's not me, that whole dynamic. It's not me. I'm not fill in the blank. I'm not racist. I'm not biased. I'm not privileged. I grew up on public benefit, a white person who grew up on public benefits, and they went to a state school and they figured it out and they pulled themselves up by the bootstraps, and here they are now a VP in the company. So it requires that there's hard, intentional work done, and that as that occurs and evolves, that you celebrate where you're successful and you continue to keep a spotlight on it. And hearkening back to what I said about George Floyd's murder, one of my biggest concerns, just as a person, and then related to companies, you know, in the workplace, is that people were so outraged initially that they didn't have the energy and capacity to stick with it for the long haul. And so it has to be a plan, a strategic plan has to be outlined within an organization so that the company, regardless of who's in the leadership, if it's not their pet project, the company will stick with it beyond, you know, the initial bonus season.
Yeah.
Let's be real, right? So just building for the long haul.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, being real, as you absolutely say, the intentionality, you know, making sure that it's absolutely happening, not just once a year, but every day for your company. I mean, Samantha, is there an example you have in your workplace of an intentionality that you could give us?
Well, so this is, I mentioned this quickly earlier, but I'm echo that if you don't set numbers, like intent is like lip service. And I tried, I didn't succeed on this, to set forth like just because, again, I think the longer you've been in the workforce, sometimes the more you've seen the disappointing outcomes of emotional, high visibility moments. And so, writing out a plan of how are we going to report the numbers publicly, like your current situation, the one Michelle had, where there was a piece of reporting in the end of a book that didn't look good and it gets squashed. Like, just give yourself, as a company, say, we're just going to report. We're not report internally. We reported externally before, when we were private. We reported our race-based comps and gender-based comps on International Women's Day, 3 years ago. And so I think reporting it, having the numbers be visible and transparent. Again, I think in trying to do that without like totally judging yourself, because if you don't report it, you're not going to make any progress. And then I think setting like the goals. Adidas did this, Adidas, where it was like there's an internal movement that demanded, like with walkout numbers, specifically, they had to choose them. You had to choose what diversity. It couldn't be like all. It's tricky because then they said Black American, and I think it was Latinx. I don't want to speak on behalf of another company, but management by this period or hiring by this within this time frame. And again, that's tricky because again, you're not going to be able to hit, I don't think, every aspect of diversity in your hiring. And if you're a small company, maybe, or so you have to choose sometimes. And then I think just reporting, constantly reporting. Are you making progress? Why not? Unpacking the why not, or why, or finding the middle management advancement, finding your pipeline. When you say it's hard to recruit, fine, this came up earlier, active recruitment, invest in the human capital to recruit. It's not hard. Well, like look at your own contact base. I can look on LinkedIn and see that the bias of my humans I know, and go for people who you don't have anyone in common with. So I think that active recruitment is one way to really get everybody involved, because you can do that regardless of your background. You should be able to recognize the numbers and move forward, and then setting numbers and just constantly reporting on your own numbers. It eliminates some of the intent elements and causes you to look at the actual outcomes.
Absolutely. Forcing yourself to look to make sure that there have actually been effects as well. Well, thank you very much to the audience members who submitted those questions. We're going to, sadly, coming down to the last part of this wonderful conversation. Thank you all so much. I've really, really enjoyed speaking with you all. And what I'd like to do is come down to a final question, really. And it's this, and if I could start with you, Kate. What is one action you would suggest for a person to help break bias?
For an individual, I think the most important, or one of the most important things, can be understanding things from the perspective of someone else. And that's not always easy, but it's something, as Samantha just pointed out, reaching out to people who aren't like you. And that can be awkward. But another thing that you can do, for example, something that I really do intentionally on social media is follow groups that I am not a part of, follow groups that do work in areas that I admire. And I don't jump into those conversations. I don't try to insert myself. I just listen, I support them, I amplify them. And so I'm really intentional about how I spend my time online, and how I diversify who I follow. And that includes in real life as well. But I think it can start online, and then having those conversations with people. If you're a man and you've never had a conversation with women about the wage gap, start a conversation. You know what I mean? Like, it shouldn't be a secret. It shouldn't be something that only women talk about. And so the next time you're in a meeting, you can say, well, I talked to someone about this and she said, da, 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 da. And from that experience, you can cite to that person you talked to about it. So I really think it can start with getting very intentionally getting outside of your comfort zone.
No, absolutely. On that one, Michelle, coming to that question, what is one action that you would suggest for a person to help break bias?
I feel like the one action would be the power of echoing, right? So if you can be that first person who speaks up, who can be that first voice that interrupts bias, I feel like there is a powerful, like, multiplying effect that can happen by doing so. And it might not happen immediately, but hopefully that would help influence folks around you and those who are witnessing for the future.
Thank you, Michelle. Samantha, if I could come to you on that one action to help break bias.
I'd say listing your own biases. It's something that it's an exercise I've done where I list 5 biases that I have, that if I recognize, because again, I don't believe any of us are free of it or probably ever going to be free of it. But recognizing 5 biases I have about men in many cases, and then 5 biases you have felt inflicted or put upon you, and trying to talk about that as a group without too much judgment.
Yeah, without too much judgment, always a good tip. Carmen, could I come to you on that question? One action you'd suggest for a person to break bias?
Certainly. I think the biggest thing for me has been to have conversations with people who are different from me, and just listening and withholding any of my perceptions. I mean, in a moment, to be vulnerable. I years ago, I didn't really understand the arc of people who said they were transgender. I'm just being honest. This was a while ago. And I just had a conversation with someone and just understood their personal journey, what they had to, what their process was to really identify their gender identification. What they were born with wasn't who they felt they were. And that single conversation or series of conversations really, really helped me to withhold bias and to look at them just as a person, just, regardless. And so it sounds so basic, but, I guess echoing all of what the ladies have shared is, having conversations, being honest and identifying where your gaps are, and then really leaning into those instead of leaning out.
Well, absolutely. I mean, and on that front, thank you for sharing that example. I mean, are you hopeful for the future, Carmen?
I am. We're coming hopefully out of a pandemic and the sun is shining. I think that the dialogues, the discussions we're having are more honest. And, I hope that transcends into, I think as people, we're being more honest. And then I hope that we can bring that honesty to work. And as we bring that honesty to work, we'll begin to see some differences and some changes.
I mean, if I could come to you finally, Kate, on that picture of optimism. I mean, obviously the research you will have done for your book and in the work that you've done on ordinary equality, fearless women is what you mentioned in your title. Are you hopeful for the future?
I'm hopeful for the future because our liberation is not dependent on what other people do and control. Our liberation is through seeking liberation. And through the process, we can make ourselves free. That sounds very woo-woo, especially maybe for a corporate panel, but I think, I'm very enthusiastic and excited about the ways in which different groups are linking up. Queer liberation and women's liberation have always been tied because they are based in misogyny. They're both based in the hatred of women and all things feminine. And so the more we can see the intersections and the more we can see that the oppression we face is largely rooted in the same things and work together, that includes LGBTQ people, that includes people of all races and ethnic minorities, that includes across class and ability and all of these different things. I think people are making links. People are working together. People are getting out of these silos, and I include myself in that project, in that learning, in that growing. And so I am very hopeful about all of our movements for liberation, linking together and working together to make all of these spaces, whether it's in the home or the workplace or, in government or wherever we find ourselves, more open and inclusive. And that gives me a lot of hope.
Well, I love to end on that point of optimism, Kate. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to the four of you, Kate, Michelle, Samantha, Carmen. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the audience. I hope you've enjoyed this insightful, honest, open conversation that we've all had. Happy International Women's Day, and I'll hand you back over to Barbie.
Sam, thank you for moderating such a deeply moving conversation. And thank you to Carmen, Samantha, Michelle, and Kate for your vulnerability and for truly sharing a piece of yourselves and for digging deep. I'm sure I'm not alone in having some active chats going on, and I can tell you that the more than 250 people who at one time were on, we have all taken so much away. I really can't thank you enough. Two, you all had so many lines that I know we're going to be quoting all day, every day, but I wrote down two in particular that I just think, really sums it up. Kate, you said rumors of progress have been greatly exaggerated. That struck a chord with all of us. And while progress has been made, there is still so much work to be done. And Samantha, you said intent is lip service. And that struck us because at Zeno, we talk a lot about the actions that we're taking and progress with a small p. To all of you, Carmen, Samantha, Michelle, again, thank you so much for giving so generously of your time. We have all learned a lot, and I especially appreciate the many practical ways that we all, starting right now, can go help to break the bias. So thank you. Happy International Women's Day. I wish you all good health and safety and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you. And thanks again, Sam. Always a joy to have you with us. Have a great day and evening, everyone. Thank you.